My name is Tyler Fry, and I'm the Bass Tutor. Today I wanted to go over a quick little tip that I like to do with a jig that a lot of people don't do, and so let's get on into it. So whenever people think of a jig, typically they're going to think about dragging it, they're going to think about popping it, they're going to think about skipping it up under a dock, putting it in some heavy cover, something like that. But what if I told you there's a way that a lot of people pass up without ever trying it? And that is reeling a jig. When you think of reeling a jig, you might think of a swim jig, but it's kind of like that, but really not. And what I mean by that is, whenever you're reeling a jig, you're going to take something like a football head jig or like a arky head jig like this one, and you're going to put a trailer on the back of it that has quite a bit of action. This one's actually got a Rage Crawl on it by Strike King, and this one has a Berkeley Pit Boss on it. Both of these have phenomenal action out of the trailers. It's got a lot of wiggling, has a lot of appendages, and just a ton of action coming off of it. And so whenever you're reeling a jig, this isn't going to be like reeling it through the top of the water column like you would a swim jig. What you're going to do instead is you're going to get kind of a little bit heavier jig, maybe a 1/2 ounce, 3/4, something like that. And you want that jig to continue to keep bottom contact. And as it goes through there, it looks like a crankbait the way it's bouncing off stuff and hitting off rocks and stuff. And so the biggest key to this is when you're reeling it, you either want to kind of reel it slow, and then whenever you feel something, pop it. And a lot of the times, whenever you're popping that jig off of that structure, that's when those fish just engulf it. They're not really one to eat, but they're there and the opportunity comes by. And if you know anything about bass fishing, you know that bass are opportunist feeders. So anytime they get the opportunity to feed, they're going to. It's like throwing a cheeseburger at a guy at the middle of a baseball game. He's going to eat it if it's free. So, you know, throwing this jig, a lot of the times the fish aren't hungry. A lot of times they are. But the biggest key to this thing, mess around with your retrieves, but always make sure you got that bottom contact. And if you bump into something, pop it. That's all there is to it. And, you know, I never had thought of this until I watched Kevin Van Dam a few years ago, back whenever MLF was just the show. And I remember he was competing and he was throwing a jig. And me and my papa were sitting there talking about it, and we're like, man, he's always fishing fast. Why is he throwing a jig? Well, the more I got to watching him, I began seeing what he was doing. He would throw the jig out there, he'd let it sit for a second, he'd flip his reel handle over, and he'd start reeling it. And then whenever he'd bump into something, he'd pop it. Or whenever he'd go through something, he'd rip it. And so what he was doing was he was still reaction fishing that we all know Kevin Van Dam for, but he was doing it with a bait that everybody else was throwing at the time, which was a jig. And he went on to do pretty good in that event, if I'm not mistaken. So I just found that really interesting. And I've tried this out multiple times. Guys, it does work, especially this time of year. With it being early spring, these fish are moving up, they're hungry, and they love to eat those craws. So just reel that thing through there. Try that next time you're out on the water. If you're trying to cover water, but you want the profile of that jig, just reel it, bump it off stuff, and see what happens. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and you learned something new. We'll see you guys later, and don't forget to wet a line. Thanks for watching.